So joining us for our second presentation of the afternoon as we take a move from the world of fiction to the world of non-fiction writing for a little while is Gabriella Braun, who is going to be talking about her debut book, All That We Are, uncovering the hidden truths behind our behaviour at work. I have to admit to being slightly nervous about the content of this one, not having had my behaviour at work analysed up until now. We shall maybe skip over some bits of the next presentation. Let's see. Gabriella is director of Working Well, which is a specialist consultancy firm which uses psychoanalytic and systemic thinking to help leaders and teams within businesses understand the hidden truths of their behaviour at work. And she's consulted to a wide variety of clients, including the British Library, the Tate, the NHS Trust, University of Cambridge, University of London, and RADA, amongst many others. Gabriella holds a master's degree in consulting to organisations and was a principal consultant in the Tavistock Consultancy Service. She now runs her own consultancy, and in the spare time between doing all of those things, she is also currently working on a novel as well, as if that wasn't enough. So I shall pass over to you, Gabriella, and I shall come back for a Q&A later on. Do please, if you want to ask any questions, again, drop them into the chat window. In the meantime, Gabriella, thank you so much.
Mark, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. It's lovely to be here, lovely to contribute in a small way to World Book Night. So I'm going to tell you, I think as Mark reacted, probably lots of people think, oh God, what does it mean to think about our behaviour at work? I don't think it's so scary, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about why I wrote the book and what I do, and I'll do a couple of readings as well and tell you something of the process that I went through in writing this book. And it's really interesting thinking about Louise's brilliant talk just now and the emphasis she puts on what people are like. And actually, really, that's what I think my book is about. It's about human nature. And I use the workplace to show that up, and the kind of things that go on between people at work. But overriding that really is what we all are like as people and what therefore happens to us. And much of that we don't think about on a regular basis. So, as Mark said, I consult to leaders and teams across different kinds of organisations. And the thing that I do that's rather different from most consultancy is to use psychoanalysis and systemic thinking. I'll focus though on the psychoanalysis now. And what I'm doing in using it, in applying it, I'm not a clinician. I'm trained to use psychoanalytic thinking and ideas and ways of, to some extent, ways of working even with organisations and in coaching. But a key thing that psychoanalysis does for me is it takes very seriously the unconscious. And I think that's something we tend to ignore. We don't think about or want to particularly know about the unconscious. And yet I think it's with us all the time. It appears in little slips of the tongue. Somebody tweeted a wonderful tweet this morning about the unconscious, which, if I remember it rightly, was a Conservative Party banner or something that said by whatever year we will have cut homeless people in two. I mean, how brilliant is that as an unconscious? Instead of saying we'll have halved homelessness, we'll have cut homeless people in two. So that's the kind of thing that the unconscious does all the time. And I think we actually ignore it at our peril, including at work. So I suppose one of my motives for writing this book was that I found my own experiences of working life incredibly varying. I had some great times at work where I really was happy, loved my being with colleagues, etc., etc., and some really hideous, miserable, incredibly stressful times, especially I have to say as a leader. And I became a leader with no training, no coaching, no support. I mean, this was a long, long time ago, and things like coaching weren't heard of at the time. But I think although people are much more likely to get coaching now, lots of people don't get coaching, and lots of people are thrown into positions with inadequate support and inadequate training and inadequate ability, because they don't have the knowledge to understand what on earth is going on. And so work can become a place that's incredibly stressful and incredibly damaging. And yet it's somewhere we spend huge amounts of time. When you think about our lives, we spend a lot of time working. And I've become more and more perturbed, really, about the kind of damage that goes on in the workplace and the drive we've been on for ever more productivity, ever higher targets, ever more, respond quicker, better, etc., etc. And at the same time, squeezing out lots of the things that people really need and making our workplaces more and more inhumane. And we know figures, which I've quoted in the book, mental health at work or mental ill health at work, the figures are terrible. Work for many people is a really difficult and disturbing experience, and it needn't be like that. So I suppose I became very passionate about thinking, how do we start to change things? And I've always felt that psychoanalysis has loads to offer, but that people like me working with organisations and with teams and leaders were just really bad at bringing the ideas into the general workplace, into the general public arena. We cushioned it away. We talked to people like ourselves. We used language that other people wouldn't understand. We spoke in jargon. I think we were rather precious. So I was quite critical of what we as a profession were doing. And I became more and more passionate about trying, therefore, to write something that wasn't aimed at people like me, but was aimed at anyone. Well, actually, that's not quite true. Let me rephrase that. To begin with, I wanted it to be aimed at leaders because of thinking leaders need to be the one that make any changes, start to make changes. So I was aiming it at leaders, and I have to say this book took me years to write, but over the years, I started to change my view about that and became clearer and clearer about what I was trying to do. I always knew that I really did not want to write an academic book. I did not want to write a psychoanalytic book. I wanted a book that would be published by a mainstream publisher. I had no idea how difficult that really is, but that was my ambition from the outset. But over time, I got clearer about what I was really trying to do. And I got clearer about the fact that I was really trying to contribute maybe in a small way, to making the workplace more humane and to humanize what we do and take account of human nature in how we design our workplaces, how we think about work, and what we do on a daily basis at work. And so because I got clear about that, I also got clear about hang on then, why would I write this for leaders? Why not just write this for anyone that is interested in understanding something of what happens at work? And so that became my aim. And I always knew I wanted to write in stories, because I think that's how we understand ourselves. We tell ourselves stories, we can relate to stories. So I knew I wanted to do that. But actually, at the beginning of my journey, I really didn't have the skills to do that. So I was writing something that came out a bit academic, but not a bit for the field, but not. It was a bit of a hodgepodge. And it took me years, mainly learning how to write, actually, and refining what I thought this book was all about, until it became what it is now. And it is now, I'll hold it up. I'm very proud of the cover, because I think my publisher did a wonderful job. And it's really narrative nonfiction is how it's now described, which I'm thrilled by. And I'm thrilled by having been able to get to the point where I could write that. So I'm going to read you just the very first paragraph and the very last paragraph of the introductory chapter, and that chapter's called Starting with Us. But if I read these to you, I think it kind of summarizes what I'm trying to do with the book. Remove the desks and chairs, the computers and cupboards, the factory floor or operating theatre, and you have people, just people, and everything we as people bring to our workplaces, our hopes, our fears, our histories and personalities, our thoughts and feelings, attitudes and beliefs, our understandable and unfathomable behaviours. We bring all that we are. And then the very last words of this opening introductory chapter. I hope in illuminating all that we are and the significance of understanding ourselves and each other, this book will contribute towards workplaces becoming more creative, inclusive, and humane communities in which people and their work flourish. So that was the aim. That was what I was trying to do. And I broke the book up into 3 parts. So the first part is human nature at work, and it's got stories that really bring to life, I think, some of the very basic parts of us that we all have. Like there's one chapter called Life and Death, which is the story of a team in running a service for eating disorders, children with eating disorders. They were a fabulous team. The service got closed down, which was awful. And I worked with them. I started before they knew they were going to be closed down. And in the end, my last ever session with them was their last ever meeting as a team. And at that point, I realised that they needed me to see them through to the end and witness their death as an organisation. And I called the chapter Life and Death because we all have within us a drive towards life. And when I say that, I mean not just staying alive, but, living our lives, a liveliness, engaging in the world, having relationships, friendships, having difficult conversations where we need to, caring about what's going on around us, having passion, commitment, those things. And we all also have a drive towards death. And I don't mean when I say that we all want to die. I'm not saying that. But I am saying we will be at times pulled towards, if you like, a deadliness where we're passive, we're apathetic, we can't be bothered. The days you kind of just want to give up and pull the duvet over your head and not bother with anything, and not try and repair things in a difficult relationship, and not do what you know you need to do, but just that passive giving up is what I'm talking about, that kind of deadliness that happens to us all. And for most of us, and indeed in most organisations, these two parts of us are they're always in tension for all of us, but that tension is unconscious. We don't really know about it. We might have glimpses, but a lot of the time it's happening in our unconscious. But in this organisation where they're dealing with life and death on a regular basis, and in fact, I tell the story about, I start the story where a child had just attempted to kill themselves. So it brings really into focus the pull between life and death and what happens to the staff when that starts going on. And then, ironically, they were killed off themselves as an organisation. So that's one of the ways I'm trying to tackle something that's really ordinary, that pull in us all, but doing it through a story and how it infuses organisations in different ways. In that first part of the book, there are other chapters like paranoia. We all get paranoid at times. We may not talk about this, but we do. And actually, we couldn't even live really without a certain degree of paranoia. We'd be way too gullible to manage in the world. So a bit of paranoia helps us. We all get a bit more paranoid than is helpful at times. I tell an example about somebody who had written a paper and their boss said they'd come and listen to it at a conference and then didn't. And then they started to get paranoid. Is the boss cross with them? Why hasn't the boss come? Why hasn't the boss mentioned that they didn't come? Am I in trouble? Have I offended the boss? All of that kind of regular noise in our heads that most of us, all of us probably will feel or hear at different times. There it all is. And it's very ordinary. It's not particularly helpful, but there you have it. And it doesn't last for that long. On the other hand, of course, paranoia can become, can go to an extreme where we get very ill. And that's a different thing again. But I'm talking about the kind of ordinary stuff in all of us. So in that section as well, there's a chapter on envy, someone who becomes, problematically envious, but it's quite ordinary. It happens to everybody. And there's something on aggression, which we've all got. Being good enough, a lot of people say, oh yes, I really relate to that. And that's a story about someone who has got everything going for him, seems to be really doing brilliantly and going places. But it turns out he constantly thinks he's not good enough. And he's got a berating internal voice that says, who do you think you are? Why did you ever think you would get that promotion? Why did you think anything good will happen? You're not good enough. And is constantly putting him down. And that is his difficulty. And I see him for coaching. He leaves coaching prematurely and actually leaves me wondering if he thought I wasn't good enough. And that's why he went. So again, regular stuff that happens to us. The looking glass is another chapter in this first section. And the looking glass is using Alice in Wonderland, really thinking about how we don't necessarily know we're doing this or don't know we're doing this, but we will wear different glasses with different lenses and they affect how we see things. So through our lenses, we will see other people in certain ways and we might see our own qualities that we find difficult in ourselves in the other person, because that's the kind of looking glass that we've put on. We've distorted how we see people and events. So, the guy who was envious might actually, in a looking glass, look at somebody else and think, God, they're really envious. And actually what he's done is turned his glasses back to front, unconsciously. And that section ends with a chapter on belonging, which I think is so important and key to our everyday life, and also key to how we are in organisations, whether we feel we belong, whether we feel included or excluded. And that's the first chapter really where I write it from me. It's my story. And I do use, and it took me a long time to get there, but I do use quite a lot of biography and memoir in the book. And I think Louise mentioned that that's, when you're doing that, it's very, I'm sorry, Louise, if I'm misquoting you, but for me, it's very exposing and it does make you feel very vulnerable, but I also think it can be very helpful. And I certainly decided to do it. And it did, as I say, take me quite a while to get to this point. But I decided it was really important because what I didn't want to be saying to the reader is, look, you lot all have these problems. I'm fine, and I'm going to tell you what your problems are. That was the last thing I wanted to be doing. What I wanted to be doing is saying, this is what we as human beings, these are the kind of difficulties, this is our destructive stuff, this is our hugely constructive stuff and our potential, this is how it can play out in the workplace, this is why some of the bewildering behaviour we find in the workplace can happen. And I'm human too, and it all happens to me too. So I thought, I actually have to tell some of my own story in order to illustrate and really be part of this, not standing back and pronouncing judgment and looking from on high at other people. So the second part of the book is how we lose ourselves. And that really is focusing on some of the ways our destructive side can get caught up in the workplace. So there's a chapter called Losing the Plot, how the board of an organisation really went rather mad, actually, and almost pulled the organisation down. I mean, it almost collapsed. And I worked with them, and one of the things that really helped me in my work with them was my own experience of being a patient in psychoanalysis, and I also talk about that intermittently through the book. And a very difficult bit in psychoanalysis when I confronted madness in myself, which was very frightening, very frightening. But it taught me a huge amount, which is that actually I'd thought sanity and insanity were fixed states. And of course, I'm not now talking about people who have very serious psychiatric illnesses, but I'm talking about the bulk of us for whom sanity and insanity fluctuate. We can be more sane and more insane at different times. Excuse me. So it was hugely important for me in analysis to confront my insanity, but also to recognise I can lose the plot and regain it. And with that in mind, I could help this board, and actually was quite confronting to them and said to them, you've gone mad, you've lost the plot. And of course they were completely shocked and horrified. I did that, and it sounds very brutal, I know, but I'd got a one-day workshop with them, and I thought, I don't have time to tread nicely. This place is about to collapse unless they pull it back. So I've actually got to confront what's going on. And they did. They heard it with difficulty and they did pull it back, and all credit to them. So that's one of the things in that chapter and in that section. Another chapter in that section is repeating patterns, which might sound familiar to you because I think we probably, most of us recognise some of the patterns will repeat, and we'll think, oh God, why am I here again? Why am I doing this again? And of course, organisations do the same thing. They get stuck in patterns that go round and round and are not helping. You know, that the unconscious aim at some point may have been to finally free yourself and do something different, but actually you keep going round in a stuck, destructive cycle. So that's another one of the chapters in that section. I'm just trying to remember some. Oh, illusion is another one. How we'll all, you know, have illusions about how things are, and it's not very reality based. Another one is turning a blind eye, which I think, again, people will recognise that in a way we have to sometimes turn a blind eye, but if we do it too much, we lose touch with reality. We collude with, well, I could now say we collude, for instance, with lying. You'll know what I'm talking about. We collude with corruption. We collude with really toxic things that kind of corrode us and our environments and our workplaces. So I think turning a blind eye is really important. We all have that tendency, and it's so important to confront it. The number of leaders that I've worked with who say that they kind of don't really like challenging slightly poor performance. I mean, if it's off the scale poor, they'll challenge it. Mark, I've just seen your comment in the chat. Thank you. Mark says you haven't seen my behaviour, my work behaviour. So what was I saying about? Oh yeah, leaders who will say, oh, I'll challenge it if it's off the scale terrible performance or behaviour, but if it's bad, or I don't like those difficult conversations, I hate conflict, I'll keep away from it. And of course, sometimes they might be right and it'll go away, but very rarely, usually things get worse because it's been ignored. We try to bury it under the carpet, and sure as hell it comes back and bites everybody on the bum. One thing, by the way, I say in the introductory chapter is that try as we might, we can't leave parts of ourselves behind when we go to work. We can't tuck them under the pillow with the pyjamas, much as we might wish we could. And we pretend that in the workplace our emotions don't really figure. You know, we're just there to work. It's all very rational. Of course, all of us is there, and we're not all very rational all of the time. We're just not. And neither are we coherent beings. We have different bits of us. Things happen in different ways. That's all playing out in the workplace. So the last section, and then I'm going to do another couple of bits of reading. This section, sorry, the last chapter in this section is difference and discrimination. And again, I tell my own story in that. And it seemed important to try and confront some of my experiences and my discovery of my own racism, and to talk from the I rather than distancing myself from what happens around us all the time. The last section of the book is how we find ourselves, and that's really the human potential. And again, Louise mentioned this, that we have such potential for constructive stuff, for love, for empathy, for compassion, for creativity, for innovation, all of those things. I think the destructive parts and the constructive parts are equal, and we're always tussling for one. Well, I don't know if they're equal, they vary a bit in different people, but overall, human beings have both of those, and we tussle for which can get the upper hand, and that will change at different moments in time. So I hope that gives you an idea. Let me just I'm going to do a little bit, read from a couple of chapters. One is called Love Refound, and this is in the final section. But I hope it gives the kind of idea of storytelling that I do in the book generally. I was scared I'd cry if we met in private, Sebastian said. He was the managing director of a literary agency, and we were in the coffee bar of a museum in central London. We'd originally arranged to meet nearby in a room they used opposite the agency, but the night before Sebastian had emailed asking to move it here. I'd almost said no, we needed a private space, but I realised his request must have meaning, so agreed. We sat at a small wooden table furthest away from the long stainless steel counter, faced by bar stools. The low hum of chatter and the soft clanking of cups filled the space. A tall, imposing man in smart black jeans, black shirt and a cream linen jacket. Sebastian regarded me with piercing eyes. I guessed he was in his late 30s. The agency, founded by him, Amelia and Ben, had just celebrated its 8th anniversary. They'd begun with 5 authors, but now represented more than 250 across a wide range of genres. They'd asked me for help, as after the first couple of years, tension and friction broke out among them, rising and ebbing, but never going away. Recently, it had blown up again and was affecting morale throughout the agency. It's tearing us apart, Sebastian said. I feel so betrayed by Ben and Amelia. He explained that although they were brilliant agents, they didn't take their management responsibilities as directors seriously. For example, Ben always inducted new staff, but had done this so half-heartedly for the last 2 hires, Sebastian had had to take over. And Amelia was meant to keep the website up to date, but hadn't. And again, Sebastian had to step in. Everything, Sebastian complained, landed unfairly with him. The sound of raucous laughter from the 3 young women perched on stools at the counter interrupted us. I can't remember the last time Amelia, Ben and I laughed like that, Sebastian said. We had such fun in the early days. And he told me, I'm going to skip lots now, but he told me how he was working so hard it was completely unfair on his family because he was never there. And he felt he had to do that because the others weren't pulling their weight. And in the end, he said he was thinking of leaving. And he just didn't know what else to do. He felt, he'd sunk everything into financially as well. He'd sunk loads into the agency, but didn't know what else he could do. When I met the other 2, both of them told me they were thinking of leaving. And it was clear that they hadn't said this to each other. And it was very possible that they would all leave and the place would fall apart. And I was somewhat alarmed. So after I'd met them as a threesome, I did a workshop with them. Sorry, as I met the 3 of them individually, I then the next day met with them and we did a workshop together. I'm going to read you a tiny bit from that. Sorry, lost myself. Okay. So they come into the workshop and they start, what I did to start with was ask them to think about what they admired in each other. They were very surprised, but it actually really helped to get them to relink to the good things that they'd lost sight of and the good qualities in each other that they'd lost sight of. And they got enthusiastic, excited. There's a little snippet here. Remember when Ben signed Antonio and we got 6-figure deals on both sides of the Atlantic and a film option all on the same day? They laughed, recalling the copious amounts of champagne they drank that evening. And the wine fridge Seb ordered that arrived the next day, ready stocked with champagne for future big deals. I moved on to the difficulties that had to be aired, if they were to stand a chance of repairing their relationships and rebuilding the agency's foundation after almost a decade of feuding. I asked them to write the issues from the past that were still affecting them on post-its. All of the issues, Amelia asked. I nodded. Are you sure? Yes. Actually, I said that much more certainly. I felt quivery, but I said yes. All of them, she repeated when I asked them to put their post-its on the wall. Yes, I held my breath. I wasn't that sure. I thought it was right, but I wasn't sure what would happen. The most difficult theme, they said as we read the post-its, was the divide between Seb and the other two. Ben looked at Sebastian apologetically. You won't want to hear this, but I feel pushed out and marginalised. Sorry. Amelia nodded. Me too. And excluded. Sebastian glanced at me. I gave a slight nod of my head. He looked at his business partners. I don't think you have a clue how I feel in all this. You say you're marginalised and excluded, but I feel abandoned and betrayed. He talked about the things they dumped with him, how he couldn't even find Amelia some of the time, and Ben refused work that meant he, Sebastian, had to do it. They responded with accusations about another agency that Sebastian was now negotiating with to merge, and the other two hadn't wanted this and he'd gone ahead anyway. And the other two were also suspicious that it was a takeover, not a merger. I was waiting for that. I knew you'd swipe me with it, Seb said, his voice bitter. It has to be talked about, I said, but let's first try to understand how the three of you have got to this place. And they talked about that. It was really tense and difficult, but they did face it together. And then in the end, Sebastian admitted that he preferred the company because they accused him of going for lunch and having drinks with the founders from the other agency and not with them. And he admitted in the end that he preferred the company of the founders from the other agency. And I said to them, you're creating the wrong threesome. Seb and the founders from the other agency instead of you three. They looked baffled. You three are the founders. Seb's threesome with the two other founders reinforces Amelia and Ben's positions at the margins instead of the centre. I suppose I turned to the other agency because I couldn't stand the friction between us, Seb acknowledged. It's been hard watching that. I was jealous, to be honest, Ben said. It's our agency, Amelia said. Yes, but where are you? Sebastian replied. At the next session, I asked them how they were. Fine, all right. How are you really? I asked. Fine. Do you ask each other this? It's intrusive, Seb said, taking the lid on and off his pen. We don't do that. You need to, I said. It's not about intruding into each other's private lives. You're partners. You need to know enough so that you can work well together and manage the agency. And then they started telling each other. Amelia told them her father was in hospital, having had a breakdown. Seb told them his mother had dementia. They didn't know any of that. So they started suddenly getting back to the kind of closeness they'd had in the early days that they'd completely lost. A couple of weeks later, I bumped into Seb with his wife and two children outside Tate Modern. He introduced me to his wife as the marriage counsellor at work. I wish you wouldn't call her that, his wife said. Me too, I laughed. He's right though, I thought, as we went our separate ways. The founders were like a married couple whose marriage had depended on burying their disagreements. Now, all the unspoken currents in the marriage overwhelmed them. Seb, feeling lonely and hurt, had fallen into the arms offered to him by the other agency, and everyone contemplated divorce. And then I'll just skip to the end of the chapter where I say, love can induce difficult feelings, including jealousy and rage, but it also connects us with our best qualities, our most humane selves. It comes in many forms and shapes, love for our work and love for the organisation as a whole, which needs us in the transient time we're there, to keep it alive. And love in our affection, care and admiration for our colleagues. Love can be inconstant, fluctuating, vacillating. It can be fickle, requiring attention, commitment and nourishment to keep going. Love can give way to hate, especially when unspoken issues poison the air and pierce its foundations. Love is found and lost, and love can be refound. I'll stop there, but I'm very happy to do another short reading if you'd like, or take questions.
Thanks, Gabrielle. That's really interesting. There are a couple of questions, so we probably ought to move to those. I'm just going to change the settings. If people want to turn a camera or whatever on and join us on screen, you now have permission to do so. There was a request from Ayan who'd like to ask a question. So please, if you want to ask it yourself, do go ahead. There we go. Hello.
Hi, Ayan. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. I mean, I can start with maybe just saying how great I found the book. And I think it's really good to have something for the general reader on this. I'm now myself doing some training in organizational consultancy, the D10. And I'm partly motivated to do it just to make sense of my own work, and it is helping with that. But I think I went in with a question, maybe a bit more unconsciously, about how to make work better for people, because what I've been seeing in my role as a counsellor, I also coach particularly women of colour who are leaders in organisations, is that people are leaving because of that lack of inclusivity and belonging. And it's like the only way to cope is to get out, set something up on your own, which makes me really sad. And then the other area I'm seeing a lot of people leaving because of as well as burnout.
Yeah.
That there is just an impossible task to do. And I think I'm trying to figure out how organizations might be able to change. And I was thinking about hope and how much hope you had. But you know, because everything you wrote in the book, I think people will really resonate with, as I did as well. And it's just, you know, how much hope is there really that things can, you know, change. And one thing that I'm thinking about particularly at the moment is leadership and the complications that are going on there. So I'm thinking a lot about job sharing and what that brings up unconsciously in terms of potential for splitting, because, you know, another way that people cope if they don't fully resign is, well, I'll do a job share or I'll work part-time, and what that's kind of doing, particularly when leaders do this as well. Yeah, so just any thoughts on that would be great.
Thank you, Ayan, and thank you. I'm so glad you liked the book. Let me start with the hope, actually. I do feel quite hopeful at the moment, because I mean, I started writing this book long before the pandemic, but I got the deal with the publisher on the 7th of February 2020. So, and at that point, we didn't have a clue what we were about to go into. But of course, as we all went into lockdown and people had to work from home, and if, you know, either completely from home if they could, or went into hybrid working, things started to really change. And that's partly why I'm hopeful, because I think, although it was horrendous and mental stress and health took even more of a knock, I think people will not be willing to work in the way they were before. And I think, talking to leaders, there are a lot of leaders now who are saying, we don't want to go back to how we did it before. And actually, one leader I talked to said, well, during the pandemic, what we put front and forward and centre was our staff and how they were. And we kept checking in with them. And actually, that was so important. And I think, and he was saying, we've got to keep taking that really seriously. And I think there has been, not everywhere at all, it's still a struggle for that to win out, but I think there is quite a move now for people to say, we can't the workplace actually wasn't working. In so many places, for things like you've said, Ian, people leaving, people burnt out, people leaving because they're excluded, etc. For so many reasons, it wasn't working. So I think the pandemic has kind of forced us to think, how do we do this differently? How do we just not go back to how it was before? That's my hope, that it's a moment. And, you know, I'm hopeful because, for instance, the Financial Times did the most brilliant review of my book. Now, that sounds terribly boastful, and it is, but I'm saying it really because who would have thought the FT would be so interested in a book that is about unconscious and people at work and their difficulties? They were then they commissioned me to write an article. So and the article was, what do managers need to do to help people come back into the workplace? So if the FT is so interested in this, that also gives me real hope that, you know, it is a moment where we might be able to say, hang on, everything changed during the pandemic. Let's not go back to normal. Whatever, normal didn't work. Why do we want to go back there? Does that answer you? Not to say there aren't difficulties.
Does that cover your question, Ian?
It does. I wondered if you had any thoughts on the job sharing complexity at all, or whether you're noticing
I do.
kind of a half in, half out, because it made me think about your paper on attachment and kind of resolving something that way.
I do. I think it's a longer conversation, which is why, sorry, I did avoid it.
No, that's
I think it's probably, but I do think there's something interesting in that, the half in, half out.
Yeah, I think I'm just noticing something around, that lots of people resigning and either setting up on their own or going somewhere else in the hope that it will be better out there, grass is greener, but also something going on around part-time job share as a way of dancing around.
I think it's also people are saying, I'm not prepared to put my full self into that.
Yeah.
It's too difficult.
Yeah. Thank you, Gabriella.
No, thank you.
Thanks, Ian. There was a question from Louise earlier on in the chat as well, who wanted to ask you whether you had to get permission from all the people you wrote about in your book in order to feature their stories.
Yeah, just as a fiction writer, it just intrigued me as to, even if you change the names, people might recognize themselves and stuff. So I just wondered about that.
Very good question. Thank you. I changed name. They're all the stories are composite. So they're anonymized, they're composite, and some bits are fictionalized in order to protect people. There were a couple where I thought no one else would know, but the organisation would know, and I got permission and checked the detail with the chief executive. There was one where I thought, no, it doesn't quite work, and I had to really slightly change the kind of organisation to make it more different.
Right, okay, yeah, so you have sort of, it's not exactly as it sort of, got it. Okay, thank you.
Or it mixes things, something's exactly as it was, but it didn't happen there, it happened there, you know.
Yeah, got it. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Louise. I was going to ask as well, I also write non-fiction. I'm fortunate because I've published with, or am publishing with, depending on where you are on the timeline, 3 or 4 different publishers. You were talking earlier about the difficulty of getting published in the first place after having written. Certainly, once you've done one, it becomes more straightforward to get other publishers, from my own experience. But can you tell everybody a little bit about your timeline from writing to actually getting published and how that went for you?
Yes. I started writing the book in 2014 and it came out in February this year. So that's quite a long timeline. As I said, I did keep changing I got much clearer and changed my ideas. I learnt to write. So that was huge. That took up quite a lot of time. And then in 2017, I got a literary agent, which was wonderful. And he got me in front of some fantastic publishers, but they said, yeah, but no. So, and then he and I parted ways. And then in December 2019, I got my current agent, and she just made a couple of suggestions. I worked on that over Christmas. We went out January and I got my publisher, which is Piatkus Little Brown. So great publisher. And I got that beginning of February 2020. Because obviously, Mark, as you know, with non-fiction, you sell on proposal and sample chapters, not on the whole book. It's quite different.
It's very different, yes. But the timeline for my first book was 10 years, so you don't have to look apologetic about your timeline.
That's very reassuring.
There was a lot of research and a break in there as well, to be fair. But yeah, it's a very different game. Getting into non-fiction, absolutely.
Yeah.
Has anybody got any last questions they'd like to throw in before we take a short break before our third presentation? Welcome, Victoria. I can see you're now here. Okay, no, in that case.
Yeah, sorry, I am. Sorry, that took me a while to unmute myself and turn my camera on, but hello.
Hello, that's fine, no problem at all. We will say hello in just a moment. In the meantime, everybody please show your appreciation in whichever Zoom fashion you choose to Gabriella for her talk and insight into her book and non-fiction writing. Thanks so much, Gabriella.
Thank you. Thanks very much.